Zion, hold this for me. So I can try to get this set up. That's perfect. Thank you. That is perfect. All right, guys and girls and guys, let's get ready to science. Is everybody done with their all right, so all right, so last time we talked about the intro to organic chemistry, guys. Okay, so we talked about what makes something be considered organic. Which element is that centered around? What element must be present? Carbon. Awesome sauce. All right, and so we talked about the difference between a monomer and a polymer. Now, what's a monomer? Right, it's small, and what can it do? It can join together to make what? Polymer. So a polymer is just a group of monomers. Now, monomers are compounds that are similar, very similar compounds that join together. And the process of joining together, what type of reaction must they undergo? Dehydration. Okay, so when monomers join together, they undergo that dehydration synthesis, which actually creates a water molecule. So if I join together a bunch of monomers and make a polymer, then what process could I use to break the polymer back down into monomers? Hydrolysis. Awesome sauce. You guys are awesome. All right, so we talked about the reason that we even care about these organic compounds in the first place is because of the biomolecules, which are organic compounds that living things make. And for biomolecules in particular, those macromolecules or those major organic molecules, which are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, are necessary and important for us to be able to live and other living things to be able to actually live. So today we're going to talk about carbohydrates and lipids, okay? And then next class we'll talk about proteins and nucleic acids. So at your table you have three things that I want to make sure you know where they are. You have a whiteboard, you have a dry erase marker, and you have a worksheet. Does everybody see that? The dry erase markers are in the little containers on the table. So, all right, everybody should have one of those. Cool beans. Now let's talk about carbohydrates, okay? When I say carbohydrates, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Food, carbon, carbs, hydrate. Okay, cool beans. All right, when you hear the word carbohydrate, it is pointing specifically to three elements in the name. Carb for carbon, O for oxygen, and the hydrate is for the hydrogen. Carbohydrates are the most abundant macromolecule on Earth, and they are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So on your worksheet, you should have the one that looks like this. Okay? On that sheet, why carbohydrate, the first category says elements. So what three elements are found in a carbohydrate? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. All right, so we know that they're composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, we talked about monomers and polymers, right? All right, so the monomer for a carbohydrate is called a monosaccharide. What does mono mean? One. And saccharide means sugar. So when I say monosaccharide, what does that mean exactly? One sugar. All right, so what happens when you eat a bunch of sugar?
You get a pump.
You get a pump. What's that pump coming from, though? A burst of what? What you get an extra burst of what real quick? Energy, right. Because our carbohydrates are a source of short-term energy storage, okay? Short-term energy storage. In fact, we get 4 calories per gram for every carbohydrate that you eat. It's going to be 4 calories per gram. That's how much energy you actually get from it. Now, the monomers are called what, guys? Monosaccharides. And what does monosaccharide mean? One sugar, okay? The most common monosaccharide is going to be glucose. There's other monosaccharides. You have fructose and galactose, deoxyribose, ribose, What are you hearing a lot of with that word? Oats. Most of our carbohydrates end with oats. Not all, but most of them are going to end with oats. Now, if we look at the board, we have 3 examples of monosaccharides here, okay? You have glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, I want to show you a little bit of organic chemistry, okay? You see right here at these junctions? Do you see an element there? No, but it's an understood carbon at each one of these junctions. Remember we talked about the fact that carbon has to make 4 covalent bonds? So what we're looking at is an understood carbon. So at each junction, whenever you see a structure like this, there's a carbon there. Now, if I look at all 3 of these compounds, these are 3 different things. What elements do I see present in them? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the great thing about the monosaccharides is that the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen ratio is 1 to 2 to 1. This is only in the monosaccharides, okay? 1 to 2 to 1. So that means that for every carbon, there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So if I know how many carbons are present, I know the formula for that monosaccharide. For instance, glucose has 6 carbons. So that means it also has 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. So the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. Now we write the symbol for the element, okay, which is capital, and then we use the number of how many of that element, we put that as a subscript, so it's down low. Y'all got it? C6H12O6. Grab your boards. Grab your boards, and I want you to write the chemical formula for a monosaccharide that has 8 carbons. A monosaccharide that has 8 carbons. Write the chemical formula for it.
Finish.
Hold on, we're going to all show it in a second. 8 carbons. Remember that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. We're going to practice several of these, so if you don't get it the first time, don't stress. All right. I'm going to count to 3. And everybody's going to show their boards. Remember, we have 8 carbons. 1, 2, 2.5, 2 3/4, 3. Awesome sauce. So H16O8. There's a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. Remember, the C must be capital, the H must be capital, and the O must be capital. We're going to follow that CHO, okay? CHO. That's the way we're going to follow that formula. Carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. All right, let's try it again. This time we have a carbon, and it has 15 carbons in it in this monosaccharide. A monosaccharide with 15 carbons. Give me the formula. Give me the formula for a monosaccharide with 15 carbons. 15. 17. No, 15. 15. 17 is 16. Duh.
I'm stuck.
We ain't in Spanish class.
That's 7.
Spanish is everywhere. All right, 1, 2, son. All right, C15, H30, O15. Let's try one more, guys. Let's try one more. Let's do a monosaccharide that has 5 carbons. Let's keep it simple. 5 carbons. A monosaccharide with 5 carbons. Is your marker not writing? Monosaccharide with 5 carbons. 5. What's that ratio? 1 to 1. All right. 1, 2. Let me see it. Cool beans, y'all killing it. All right, C5, H10, O5. So our monosaccharides are going to have a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. Now, when we start dealing with our complex carbohydrates, that's going to be different because remember, when two monomers join, what process is that? What process joins monomers? Dehydration. And in dehydration, what do we make? Water and a polymer, right? Water, a molecule of water is made. So we pull out two hydrogens and an oxygen, so we lose that 1:2 to 1 ratio. But if I join two monomers together, two monosaccharides make a disaccharide. What does di mean? Two. What does saccharide mean? Sugar. So disaccharide means what? Two sugars. All right. Common disaccharides. Sucrose, table sugar. That's glucose plus fructose. Lactose. That's glucose and galactose. Lactose is milk sugar. Or if you have two glucose molecules, that's maltose or malt sugar. Again, what do all of those end with? Ose. So if I see ose, what should I think? Sugar. Exactly. Good job, Cam. When I see ose, I should think sugar. Now, if we have more than two monosaccharides, we call that a polysaccharide. So the polymers are polysaccharides. What does poly mean? Many, multiple. All right. So if I have a polysaccharide, what is that? Multiple sugars, many sugars. I'm going to have more than two sugars. All right. So polysaccharides can either serve as a storage molecule, so it stores energy, or a structure molecule. And they're different in plants and animals. Let's talk about animals first because we're animals. Yeah. Glycogen is an energy storage molecule. We can store about a day's worth of glycogen in our muscles and in our liver. That's why athletes carbo-load. An athlete will carbo-load so that they can store enough glycogen in their muscles to help them out in the race, or if they're racing or whatever they're doing. Why? What is glycogen made of? Sugar. What does sugar give us? Energy. It's a source of short-term energy storage. So glycogen is stored by animals for short-term energy storage. Okay, that's how we store our sugars. Some animals, arthropods and insects especially, use what's known as chitin as their exoskeleton. Ever stepped on a bug and it went crunch? Eating crab legs, broken open the outside of a lobster tail or something. I'm getting hungry. Let me stop talking about that. It is lunchtime. All right, but anyway, that's the exoskeleton, and the exoskeleton is made of chitin. Chitin is a polysaccharide. So what is chitin made of? Sugars, exactly. It's made of sugars, but it's a structural polysaccharide and one that we don't digest. All right, now let's talk about plants. Anybody in here like potatoes? You can fry them, bake them, boil them, mash them, add ketchup to them. Oh, whew, lunchtime. All right, but anyway, guess what a potato is? It's what do we call potatoes? What are they? It's a source of starch. It's a carbohydrate. Exactly. It's a source of starch. It's a carbohydrate. Those are carbs. Plants, through photosynthesis, make carbohydrates for themselves. And they store them, the excess carbohydrates, they store as starch. Guess what we do? We eat it. Why do we eat the starch? Well, I mean, it is good, but I mean, that's the outside. But why do we need the starch? What do we use the starch for internally? Energy. It's a source of energy. Now, the plant cell walls, though, are made of a different polysaccharide, and it's called cellulose. Okay? We can't break down cellulose. We tend to call cellulose fiber. What does fiber do for your diet? Well, we don't absorb it. It keeps you regular. It keeps your pipes clean. Think of cellulose as being like the scrub brush that goes through your body and gets all that excess gunk off the walls of your intestines so it can slide right through, if you get my drift. It goes in the toilet and you press flush. All right, so cellulose is the structure polysaccharide for plants. Okay, starch is the storage polysaccharide for plants. Now, what's the storage polysaccharide for animals? How do we store sugars?
Well,
In what?
in our bodies.
Where? In what molecule? In what compound? It's called glycogen. Say it with me. Glycogen. How do we store sugars?
With glycogen.
Say it again. How do we store sugars? Glycogen. How do we store sugars?
Please pardon this interruption. At this time, we need Brayton Irvin to come to the front office, please. Brayton Irvin, please come to the front office.
All right, so how do we store sugars? Glycogen. All right. How do plants store sugars?
With
Starch. That's it. How do plants store sugars?
starch.
How do we store sugars?
Glycogen.
How do plants store sugars?
Starch.
How do we store sugars?
Glycogen.
How do plants store sugars?
Starch.
What's the plant structure polysaccharide? Cellulose. Somebody got. All right. What's the animal structure polysaccharide? Got quiet on me. Chitin. Chitin. Right here. Chitin. Not chitin, but chitin. Got it?
That's how we say
You gonna say chitin? It's chitin. All right. Now let's look at the difference between a monosaccharide and a polysaccharide. What does monosaccharide mean?
One second.
One sugar. What is the most common monosaccharide? Say it, Cam. You're right. Glucose. Awesome sauce. What elements make up carbohydrates? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. What's the ratio of carbon to hydrogen and oxygen in a monosaccharide? 1 to 2 to 1. Y'all killing it. All right. What do most carbohydrates end with? Oats. Cool beans. All right. So you see here, this is a ring. This ring represents a monosaccharide. So when I see one of these, I know that this is what? Monosaccharide. What happens when I see multiple? What does this mean? What is this? That's a polysaccharide. All right. Again, I forgot. Can y'all remind me? What is the storage molecule for plants that's a carbohydrate? Starch. Okay, well then how do animals store carbs? Glycogen. Y'all killing it. Y'all killing it. I'm loving it. All right, so look at your worksheet. Let's make sure we have this filled out on carbohydrates, okay? Look at the worksheet. Make sure we have that filled out. All right, what are the elements in a carbohydrate? What do we call the monomers? Monosaccharide. What's an example of a monosaccharide? I want you to write an example of a monosaccharide under there. What would be an example? Glucose, right? Glucose would be a great example. All right. What do we call the polymers of carbohydrates? Polysaccharide. That's right. Polysaccharide. And what would be an example of a polysaccharide?
We got white.
We eat it. Starch. All right. So starch would be an example. Glycogen would be an example. Cellulose would be an example, or chitin would be an example. Those are the 4 examples I want you guys to make sure you know, okay? Starch, cellulose, glycogen, and chitin are the 4 polysaccharides I want you to make sure you know, okay?
And chitin.
Yes, chitin. All right, what's the main function of a carbohydrate?
Energy.
What kind of energy though? Short-term energy storage. It's important that we realize that carbohydrates are short-term energy storage because we're going to talk about lipids next, and lipids are long-term energy storage, okay? So you have to make sure you know which one is long-term and which one is short-term. All right, now look at the bottom of that sheet. You have 6 pictures, one represented by Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, and Foxtrot. Which one of those is the picture of a carb? Charlie is correct. Good job. Charlie is a monosaccharide. So that is a carbohydrate. All right. Any questions about the carbohydrates before we move on to lipids? What's up? The examples of polymers? Sure. The examples of polymers would be chitin, glycogen, starch, and cellulose. You're welcome. You got a question, Orion? What you need? Repeat all of which one? The whole thing for carbohydrates? Sure. The elements are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The monomer is the monosaccharide. An example of that would be glucose. The polymers are the polysaccharides. And an example of that would be chitin, cellulose, glycogen, or starch. Okay, there's 4 different examples of a polysaccharide. The main function of a carbohydrate is short-term energy storage. And for those of you that's trying to spell those polysaccharides, they're right here. Glycogen, chitin, starch, and cellulose. Okay? Any other questions about carbohydrates before we move on to lipids?
No, ma'am.
And coincidentally, I did put the slides for you in Canvas as well. So if you miss anything, you can just go back to where it says Young's Lecture Part 2. And that link right next to it is the PowerPoint slides for today. So if you miss anything, you can always go back and look there.
Well, you can go to the video.
All right. Now let's talk about lipids. So lipids, unlike the other 3 major organic molecules, are not made of monomers. Okay, they have different parts that make up lipids. So since they're not made of monomers, they're not actually a polymer. Because in order to be made of a polymer, you have to be made of monomers, right? So lipids are the only ones that's not a true polymer. There's 4 main classes of lipids. We're going to talk about 3 extensively. One of them is just get an honorable mention because I feel like it should be mentioned. But the 4 classes would be triglyceride, phospholipid, steroid, and wax. If you look at your sheet, you'll see that we have triglyceride, phospholipid, and steroid listed on your worksheet. Okay, waxes I'll talk about, but you can remember the waxes without actually writing it down. Now, most lipids are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, with the exception of the phospholipids. So let's look at our worksheet. Where you see triglyceride, by the elements you should write carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So that's C, H, and O. Now your phospholipid is different because it has phosphorus, so it's CHOP, C-H-O-P. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. The symbol for phosphorus is a capital P. Okay? So you should write CHOP there, C-H-O and P.
What was the last one?
Phosphorus,
Phosphorus?
which is a capital P. The symbol for phosphorus is a capital P. And your steroids, we're going to write carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay? Now, the difference between the carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens in lipids and the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens in carbs is that there's very little oxygen in a lipid. It's a lot of carbons and a lot of hydrogens in a lipid, but very little oxygens. Write this down. The energy is in the bonds between carbon and hydrogen. Write it somewhere. I don't care where you write it. Just make sure you write it because you need to remember it. The energy is in the bonds between carbon and hydrogen.
The bonds
So the energy that is stored
between
is going to be stored in the bonds between carbon and hydrogen. Where can I find the energy?
oxygen.
In the bonds, okay? In the bonds where? Between carbon and hydrogen. Where do I find the energy?
Between carbon, hydrogen.
In the bonds between carbon and hydrogen. So that's where the energy is going to be. That's important because our lipids have a lot of carbon-hydrogen bonds. Okay, they have these long hydrocarbon tails, so we can get a lot of energy from lipids. Remember I told you get 4 calories per gram out of a carb? In a lipid, you get 9 calories per gram. That's twice as much and then some, okay? So, the one thing that all the lipids have in common is that they are water insoluble. Do we know what that means? When I say something is water insoluble, do you know what that means?
Water resistant.
It won't dissolve in water. It's water resistant. It hates water. It is hydrophobic. Hydro meaning water, phobic means fearing. Hydrophobic. Your lipids do not like water. Let's think about our carbohydrates. Think about sugar. Will sugar dissolve in water? Yes. So it's water soluble. That means it's hydrophilic. It loves water. It interacts with water. But fats and oils, on the other hand, are hydrophobic. Think about if you pour oil into a glass of water, what's going to happen? It's going to separate. It does not mix together because fats are water insoluble. And the scientific name for fats and oils is triglyceride. So on your paper, under triglyceride, write fats and oils so you'll know what that actually means, okay? Triglycerides, under it says lipid triglyceride. Under triglyceride, write fats and oils. So you'll have something to relate it to. Now, what does tri mean? 3. All right, so there's 2 parts that make up a triglyceride, okay? 2 parts. You have glycerol and fatty acid chains, okay? Now, right here, you see this going down back here? This is the backbone of a triglyceride. This is your glycerol. The glycerol is the backbone. Coming off of each carbon in that glycerol is a fatty acid chain. How many fatty acid chains do you see?
3.
There's 3. Hence the prefix tri. Okay, in the triglyceride, there's 3 fatty acid chains attached to a glycerol backbone. Okay, so we call it a triglyceride. Now, see these little junctions right here? Do y'all remember what element I told you is at every junction when you don't see an element? Carbon. So each one of those represents a carbon, and each one of these carbons has at least 2 hydrogens attached to it. That's a lot of carbon and hydrogen, right? Now, what did I tell you about the energy? Where's the energy? In the bonds between what? Carbon and hydrogen. So I got a lot of energy being stored in this fatty acid. And then how many do I have?
3.
There's 3. Now, a fatty acid can be classified as saturated or unsaturated. Ever heard of saturated fats and unsaturated fats? I'm pretty sure we've heard about this with diet stuff and food stuff, right? This is what it's talking about, okay? You see how every carbon only has 1, these lines represent bonds, guys, okay? Every carbon has 1 bond between the next carbon. That's called a saturated fat. That means that this carbon is only making single bonds to every other carbon in that chain. That's a saturated fat. Now, what do you see about this one? You see right here? Is that a single bond or a double bond? That's a double bond, right? So because there's a double bond here, this is called an unsaturated fat. If there's at least 1 double bond, we call this an unsaturated fat. This is unsaturated. How many double bonds do I have here? 1. What's the prefix for 1? Mono. So specifically, I would say this is a mono unsaturated fat. You ever heard that before? Next time you get a bag of chips or something, look on the back of the bag under the ingredients. I bet you'll see something that says mono unsaturated fat. Okay? And so now you'll know what that means. That means in that chain of the fatty acid, at least one of the one carbon is making a double bond. Now, is it more than 1 double bond in this one?
Yes, ma'am.
So you would call this a polyunsaturated fat. Okay? So I have a saturated, a monounsaturated, and a polyunsaturated. Y'all with me? Now, ever seen, is it called lard? It's like white and it comes in a can and you can use it to cook with, okay? And then you've seen like vegetable oil or canola oil or something like that, right? All right. Animal fats are saturated fats. Animal fats are solid at room temperature. So think like butter or lard. At room temperature, they're solid. That would be a saturated fat. Plant fats are unsaturated fats, and at room temperature, they would be a liquid. Now, which one do you think is considered the healthy fat? The saturated or the unsaturated? Unsaturated, because typically things that come from plants are better for you than things that come from animals. So the unsaturated fat that comes from plants will be considered better for you than the saturated fat that comes from animals. Okay? Y'all with me?
Yeah, but it's benefit class.
All right. That's a matter of opinion. I agree with your opinion, but everybody else don't agree. All right. Now, the phospholipid. So, let's come down to the phospholipid. That's the second class of lipids. What are the four elements that make up a phospholipid? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. Phosphorus. So you should have CHOP. CHOP. Okay? Phospholipids have 3 parts. Remember, your triglyceride had how many parts? 2. It had glycerol and fatty acids. Now, I had 3 fatty acids, but it was just fatty acids. Glycerol was 1 part. Fatty acids was the other part, but there was 3 of them. Your phospholipid has 3 parts. I still have the glycerol. I still have the fatty acids, but instead of 3, I only have 2, because one of the fatty acids is replaced with a phosphate group. Okay? So I have a glycerol backbone, 2 fatty acids, and a phosphate group. Now, this does something special to the phospholipid. These are hydrocarbons, right? These are hydrophobic. They do not like water.
Yes, ma'am.
But phosphate loves water. So the phospholipid is a molecule that has one side that loves water and another side that doesn't like water. So this molecule has a hydrophilic head or a water-loving head and hydrophobic tails, water-fearing tails. The purpose of the phospholipid is it actually makes up the cell membrane. Without phospholipids, we have no cells, right, Eli? Right. So without phospholipids, we would not exist, okay? And they have to have this water-loving part as well as this water-fearing part, because the majority of the inside and outside of the cell is water. So we'll talk about that more, though, when we get to the cell, which I think is the next unit. All right. So our next lipid, and we're going to come back and fill in the sheet together. Our next lipid would be the steroids. Now, our steroids are easy to recognize because they have 4 fused hydrocarbon rings. How many rings do you see here? 4, and they are fused together, okay? Make sure you pay attention to the fact that the rings are fused together. Your steroids, the parts, we're going to have 4 fused hydrocarbon rings. Now, steroids are used to regulate biochemical processes, cell communication, chemical signaling is what it's for. Cover your. That's how cells communicate with each other. The most common steroid we know is cholesterol. You ever heard of cholesterol? All right, cholesterol. Cholesterol can be used as a basis for making those sex hormones, okay? So testosterone in guys, estrogen and progesterone in females, okay? That's what the steroids are used for. And what do your hormones do? They send signals through your body to let your body know it's time to do certain things, like start puberty. Right. There's a lot of that going on in here, huh? All right, moving on. So, honorable mention would be our waxes, okay? Waxes are also, it's not on the chart, waxes are also a lipid, and they're used as a protective covering. The wax in your ears, the beeswax, the wax that people use to wax their cars, the waxy covering on the outside of leaves. Why do you think wax is a good protective covering? It's water resistant, right? It's a lipid. It does not like water, so it is water resistant. Two things I want to mention also about the triglyceride. In addition to the main function of the triglyceride is long-term energy storage. But in addition to that, the triglyceride also provides insulation and protection for internal organs. Why do you think fats will provide insulation? Well, that too, but think about it. Think about animals like polar bears and things like that. They build up their fat layer to protect them from the cold temperatures because the fat serves as a source of insulation. Okay? So, anywho, that's that on that. That's all we have for today on your major organic molecules. We covered 2, carbohydrates and lipids. Now, let's go back to our chart and let's make sure we have our chart filled out on our carbohydrates and lipids. All right, so we have carbs done for sure. Now let's go over lipids. What are the elements found in a triglyceride?
Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen.
Cool beans. What are the parts of a triglyceride? Glycerol and 3 fatty acids. What would be an example of a triglyceride? Saturated and unsaturated fats. Okay? Those would be your examples, a saturated fat or an unsaturated fat.
Say it again.
Saturated or unsaturated fats would be an example. Saturated or unsaturated fats.
Saturated
Or unsaturated fats. It's right here on the board. Saturated or unsaturated fats.
Okay.
All right. What's the main function of a triglyceride? That's it. Long-term energy storage. Cool beans. Love it. Now let's look down at the bottom. We know it's not Charlie because we know Charlie is a carbohydrate, but Alpha, Bravo, Delta, Echo, or Foxtrot, which one of those represents the triglyceride? Alpha. Cool beans. Y'all killing it. Love it. All right.
1 second.
So, going back through, what's another name for a triglyceride, by the way? Fats and oils. All right. So the elements will be carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Our parts will be glycerol and 3 fatty acids. The examples would be saturated and unsaturated fat. Our main function would be long-term energy storage, but don't forget that it also functions for insulation and protection of internal organs, okay? Those are 2 other functions, just not the main function. It also functions for insulation and protection of internal organs. Insulation and protection of internal organs. Those are 2 other functions of a triglyceride. Now, the phospholipid. What are the elements that make up the phospholipid? And the P word, phosphorus. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus, okay? And the parts of a phospholipid would be glycerol, 2 fatty acids, and phosphate. Glycerol, 2 fatty acids, and phosphate, okay? Glycerol, 2 fatty acids, and phosphate. Those are the parts of a phospholipid. Now, the example would be the cell membrane, as well as the main function is to make the cell membrane. Like, that's what the phospholipid, that's its job, okay? An example would be cell membrane, and the function would be to make the cell membrane. Now, which one of those pictures down there represents the phospholipid? Echo. Good job. I'm going to go back over it, Muhammad. I'm going to go back over it. All right, the phospholipid. The elements are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. The parts, glycerol, your 2 fatty acids, and phosphate. Your example is the cell membrane. The main function is to create the cell membrane. And the picture of the phospholipid would be echo. That is your phospholipid. Also, I will put a copy of this in Canvas for you once at the end of the day, once I've done every class. So if you miss something, you can go back and fill in your worksheet and make sure it's complete, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, now the steroid. What are the elements for the steroids? Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. What are the parts? 4 fused hydrocarbon rings, okay? 4 fused, right here at the top. 4 fused hydrocarbon rings. We're going to have 4 fused hydrocarbon rings. All right. An example would be cholesterol or your sex hormones. The main function, chemical signaling, cell communication. Okay, that means the same thing. Chemical signaling, cell communication, regulation of biological processes all means the same thing. Okay, so chemical signaling would be your main function. Cell communication, chemical signaling, same thing. All right. Now,
Can you go over the examples?
the example would be cholesterol or sex hormones. All right. So which picture?
Florida.
Foxtrot, Florida. Foxtrot. That's right. That is the foxtrot down there. All right, going back over it real quick. Elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Parts, 4 fused hydrocarbon rings. Example, cholesterol or sex hormones. Main function, chemical signaling, cell communication. And it's picture foxtrot, yes.
Did you say rings?
Rings. Yeah. 4 fused hydrocarbon rings. See these right here? This is considered a hydrocarbon ring. And so there's 4 of them and they're fused together. So that's your parts of the steroid. All right. Now, let's turn to page 73.
Oh, we're not doing protein.
We're not doing what? Proteins is next class. All right. Proteins and nucleic acids will be Thursday. You need your whiteboards, guys. Everybody's going to write an answer. Remember, this was your homework, so it should already be done. So there's no need for me to wait for you to do it. All righty. So,
Page 78?
page 73. 73. All right. 73.
Oh, I have it here.
So, question 1. Through photosynthesis, plants convert light energy into chemical energy. Which macromolecules are produced during this process? Well, we're going to all write it down, but that was the correct answer, so everybody should get it right now. All right, on the count of 3, you're going to show it to me. 1, 2, and 3. Bam! Bravo. 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 All right, moving on. Question 2. The diagram below shows the typical structure of what? Do-do-do-do-do-do. 1, 2, 3. Let me see it. That is a polysaccharide. So delta is the correct answer. That's a polysaccharide.
Already.
Question 3. Which of the following is considered a monosaccharide? Which of the following is considered a monosaccharide? 1, 2. Is it 3?
No. Trace.
No, not Spanish, French. Trois. One. Okay, just go. Alright, alpha glucose is the monosaccharide. Alright, I don't speak French. Spanish either. Barely speak English. Alright, oh, teach me 1, 2, 3. What? Wa, wahid, ne, trata. Wahid, ne, trata. Alright, we was on, hey, y'all come on now. That was number 4. He just taught us 1, 2, 3. I'm gonna get that. Alright, so that was number 4. Carbohydrates are constantly required by organisms to carry out which main function? Provide a source of energy. What type of energy storage, guys? Long term or short term for carbs? Short term, cool beans. Alright, question 5. Which processes can break down glycogen stored in the liver into glucose? Ichi, ni, san. That was something that one of my friends whose father was in the army, was stationed in a base in Japan, taught me. So I don't know. I don't know what language it is, but I can count to 3. Right. And she taught me, she said, this ichi ni san. So that's how I learned the first 3. 1, 2, 3. All right. All right. So anyway, that was delta. You break down with hydrolysis. How do you build up? Dehydration. Cool beans. All right. What's another word for dehydration? Condensation. Condensation. Make sure you familiarize those two, okay? It may say dehydration, it may say condensation. That's the same thing. Alright. Just tell me. Organic molecules all contain which element? Carbon. Which elements are in a carbohydrate? Cool beans. Plants use this polysaccharide to make their cell wall. Cellulose. Y'all killing it. True or false? Carbs are joined together by peptide bonds. False. We haven't talked about peptide bonds, so that ain't it. Alright. True or false? A disaccharide is an example of a carbohydrate. True. Monosaccharides are made of polysaccharides. No, that's false. Polysaccharides are made of monosaccharides, not the other way around, okay? That's backwards. Alright, polymers are made of monomers. True. Polysaccharides are the simplest form of carbohydrates. False. Right. Monosaccharides are the simplest form, not polysaccharides. And that picture on the page, is it a monosaccharide, a disaccharide, or a polysaccharide? Monosaccharide. How many rings you see there? 1. That's a monosaccharide. All right. Turn to page 77. Turn to page 77. On the boards again, we're writing the answers. What are the organic molecules used for long-term energy storage? Write it. It's okay. I'm glad you're excited about it. 1, 2, 3. Bravo.
Yeah.
Love it when a plan comes together. Alright. I lost my... Oh. That's that old lady. I had to bend down. Whew. I'm tired now, y'all. That one being. Alright. 2. Which kind of lipid acts as a chemical messenger? Which kind of lipid acts as a chemical messenger? 1, 2, 3. Charlie, guys, your steroid hormones are the chemical messengers, okay? The chemical messengers are your steroid hormones. All right, this one has 2 answers. What are 2 parts of a fat molecule? What are 2 parts of a fat molecule? 1, a 2, a 3. Echo and foxtrot. Fat is glycerol and fatty acids. Glycerol and fatty acids. That's cool. All right, 4. Which 3 are major functions of fat? Which 3 are major functions of fat? Which 3 are major functions of fat? There's 3 answers there. That's major functions of fat. Which 3? Do 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 do. 4, 5, 4, 6. Do 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 do. 1, a 2, a 1, a 2, a 3. And the answers are alpha, Charlie, and delta. Insulation, protection of organs, and long-term energy storage. Alpha, Charlie, and delta. Please be mindful of multiple part questions because on the district test, if you don't get them all right, they don't give you any credit. Okay? So we want to be mindful of those. All right, and number 5. What is the main function of phospholipids? What is the main function of phospholipids? 1, 2, 3. Delta. Delta it is. All right, guys and girls and guys, before you close your notebooks, you need to make sure that you are able to fill out that chart on page 76 as well as the chart on page 72. So there's 2 charts, one on page 76, one on page 72. You should be able to fill out both of those charts completely. If you cannot, you need to ask questions about those. Once you finish those, you have a science skills activity in Pearson, and you have an exit ticket. Exit ticket is like 3 questions in Canvas. I would suggest you do the exit ticket first and then move on to the science skill activity. The science skill is another interactivity. The exit ticket is to go over what we went over today in class, okay? If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yes, ma'am? The calories per gram, that's how much energy you can get from a carb, and that's 4 from a carb and 9 from a lipid. 4 calories per gram from a carb and 9 calories per gram from a lipid. All right. I am going to come around and check and make sure that you have filled out those 2 charts. So do not put your notes up until I make my way around to make sure that you have filled out those 2 charts. But I have to put my mask on to come around that way. So I will be checking page 72 and page 76. Okay, I will be checking the charts on page 72 and 76 to make sure you have filled those out. So do not put your notes up until after I have come around to you. As always, it has been a joy doing science with you. Let's go ahead and get some more practice in.